The Rockefeller women had more money than most countries will ever see, names attached to buildings across the world, and a loneliness that almost nobody ever wrote down. A woman who co-founded one of the greatest museums in history and had to hide the paintings she loved in a private room because her husband did not want to look at them. A first wife who held a marriage and a public face together for 30 years and was thanked with divorce papers so her husband could marry someone else. A daughter who watched 5 younger brothers receive every advantage the family had while the biographers walked straight past her. A second wife who changed how America understood breast cancer, not because she wanted to be an advocate, but because she simply could not pretend the thing had not happened to her body. What those women actually went through, what they gave, what it cost them, and who they became, is the story we are telling today. To understand the lives of these women, you first have to understand what the Rockefeller family actually was. John D. Rockefeller Sr. founded Standard Oil and became the first American to accumulate a personal fortune exceeding $1 billion in real terms. He is still, adjusted for inflation, one of the wealthiest private individuals in the history of the modern world. His son, Junior, spent his adult life trying to give the money away responsibly, funding museums and parks and universities and medical research on a scale no private individual had attempted before. Junior's 5 sons became governors and ambassadors and bankers and conservationists. Their names are on buildings across New York, across the country, across the world. The women are mostly in the footnotes. They are described in the biographies as devoted partners and gracious hostesses and committed supporters. And then the chapter moves on. But the full story of what they built and what they endured is the one worth sitting with. And it begins with the woman who should have more buildings named after her than almost anyone in this family. A woman who loved something her husband could not understand and built something the world could not do without. Her name was Abby, and she founded a museum because no one would listen. Abby Green Aldrich was born in 1874 in Providence, Rhode Island. Her father was a United States Senator. She grew up in a household where ideas were taken seriously and money was understood to carry obligation alongside privilege. She married John D. Rockefeller Jr. in 1901 when she was 26 and he was 27. And on paper, it looked like the joining of 2 of the most powerful families in America. In practice, it was a marriage between 2 people who were almost entirely mismatched in temperament. Junior was his father's son in every way that mattered domestically. He was disciplined and methodical and deeply religious and constitutionally uncomfortable with anything that felt spontaneous or excessive. He kept meticulous accounts of every penny in the household. He did not drink. He did not dance. He was not a cold man, but he was a controlled one. And that control extended to everything around him, including the walls of their homes. Abby was different. She was warm and social, and genuinely, passionately committed to modern art at a moment when almost nobody in America with serious money took modern art seriously. She loved Cézanne and Matisse. She found in painting a language for the parts of herself that had no other outlet in the life she was living. She believed that art was not decoration, but a form of knowledge, a way of understanding what it felt like to be alive at a particular moment in history. Junior did not share this. He found modern art, in his own documented words, difficult to understand and harder to justify. He was simultaneously pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into hospitals and universities and historic restoration projects, and he genuinely could not see what Abby was trying to do or why it mattered. He told a biographer he could not see what all the fuss was about. Abby kept going. In 1929, she co-founded the Museum of Modern Art in New York City with 2 other women, Lizzie Plimpton Bliss and Mary Quinn Sullivan. What they created became one of the most consequential cultural institutions of the 20th century. MoMA shifted the center of the art world from Europe to New York. It shaped what the world understood serious art to be, and it continues to do that today. Abbey built it, and funded it, and organized it, and advocated for it. And she did all of it with her own money and her own labor, and against the expressed reluctance of her husband, who was one of the wealthiest men on earth. The paintings she loved most never hung in the formal rooms of the house they shared. She had a room for them at the top of a building on their estate. A private room, away from the house, away from Junior's taste, away from every space the family moved through together. She went there alone. She died in 1948. Junior survived her by 13 years, and in the years after her death, he gradually placed some of her modern works in more prominent spaces. It is the kind of thing that happens when widowers finally understand what their wives had been telling them for decades. It always arrives too late. MoMA still stands. Abby's name is on the sculpture garden. It is a beautiful garden. But the story of what it cost her to build what she built is not on any wall inside it. Their only daughter was named Abigail Green Rockefeller and known her entire life as Babs. She was born in 1903, the first of their 6 children, the eldest by several years. After her came 5 sons: John III, Nelson, Lawrence, Winthrop, and David. Those 5 boys received educations and grooming and institutional preparation that readied them to run foundations and govern states and sit on the boards of the most powerful organizations in the country. Babs was expected to marry well and manage a household. She was by every account bright and headstrong and entirely unimpressed by the family mythology. She was the person at the table who said the thing nobody else would say. She had watched close enough and long enough to know what the money actually cost, and she did not find it entirely glamorous. She married twice. She raised a daughter. She lived in the margins of the family narrative, not entirely by choice, and when the biographers arrived, they wrote about the brothers and kept walking. She died in 1976. The brothers had foundations named after them. Babs had a daughter who loved her. Of all the women who married into the family in the second generation, the one whose story carries the most sustained weight is Mary Todd Hunter Clark. She was born in 1907 in Philadelphia, and she married Nelson Rockefeller in 1930, 11 months after they met. Nelson was already one of the most dynamic personalities of his generation. Handsome and restless and entirely convinced of his own destiny. He wanted to be president of the United States and would spend much of his adult life trying to become exactly that. He ran for the Republican nomination in 1960, in 1964, in 1968. He never won it. But he served 4 terms as governor of New York, and he was vice president under Gerald Ford, and he was never, in any room he entered, not the most important person in it. Mary Todd Hunter Clark was none of these things. She was composed and private and genuinely unpretentious. She was not a natural campaigner. She was not drawn to the enormous operatic scale of a Rockefeller event. She was by temperament a woman who would have been happiest in a smaller and quieter life. She had married one of the most relentlessly ambitious men in America. For 30 years, she ran the family's households and raised their 5 children and appeared beside him at every function and dinner and political event that required a wife to be standing there. What she came to know over those years was that Nelson was unfaithful. Consistently, and with the impunity that extreme wealth and political power tends to give men who want it. The affairs were numerous. They were known within certain circles in New York. The woman who would eventually become his second wife was not the first to overlap with the marriage, and was not the last. Mary did not speak publicly about any of this. The rules were explicit. You did not discuss the private life. You presented a composed face. You carried what you knew inside yourself, and you kept moving. Then in 1962, Nelson told her he wanted a divorce. He wanted to marry a younger widow named Margaretta Murphy. It was a political event as much as a personal one. The Republican Party of the early 1960s had firm views about divorce, and it was widely expected to end his presidential ambitions. Nelson ran for the nomination anyway in 1964, and again in 1968. He never won it. Mary lived 30 more years after the divorce. She remained in New York. She stayed close to her children. She never gave a single interview about what the marriage had been. She died in 1999 at the age of 91, having outlived Nelson by 20 years. She went without ever telling her story to anyone who wrote it down. She is mentioned in his biographies when the divorce comes up, and then mostly not again. The woman Nelson left her for was known to everyone simply as Happy. Margaretta Fitler Murphy was born in 1926 in Philadelphia, and she had a warmth and social ease that were genuinely different from Mary's contained dignity. She was 36 when she married Nelson in May of 1963, 6 months after his divorce from Mary was finalized. She was the second wife, the one the marriage had been broken for, and in the moral accounting that American society applied to women in the early 1960s, that fact preceded her into every room she entered for years. She became the governor's wife and eventually the second lady of the United States when Gerald Ford nominated Nelson to the vice presidency in 1974. She was the second lady for 14 months, until Ford and Rockefeller did not win the 1976 election and the Washington chapter closed. What Happy is most remembered for is something she did not choose to be remembered for. In October of 1974, she disclosed publicly that she had been diagnosed with breast cancer and had undergone a mastectomy. The announcement came just weeks after Betty Ford had made a similar disclosure about her own surgery. The timing was not coordinated, but the effect of two prominent women speaking openly about breast cancer within such a short span was immediate and measurable. Breast cancer in 1974 was not discussed. Women were diagnosed alone and recovered alone and died alone, in the sense that the disease was considered too intimate and too specifically female to be named in public. Happy Rockefeller and Betty Ford changed that simply by saying what had happened to them. The number of women who sought early screening in the weeks that followed both announcements jumped in the medical record. Women who are alive today because of that jump outnumber the people who remember Happy Rockefeller's name. She did not set out to become a public health landmark. She was a woman who had experienced something frightening and found she could not pretend it had not happened. Nelson died on January 26, 1979, of a heart attack. He did not die in the way originally reported. The initial statement said he had collapsed while working late at his office. The account was revised. He had been with his 26-year-old assistant in his townhouse on West 54th Street. Happy was at their home in Pocantico Hills. The circumstances were reported and then glossed over and moved past in the way such things tended to be moved past when powerful men were involved. Happy survived him by 26 years. She died in 2015. She had carried the weight of the marriage she had helped break up, the scrutiny that followed, the further affairs that marked her own years as his wife, and the manner of his death, with a composure the outside world tended to read as contentment. Whether it was is something she never said. While Nelson's marriages were playing out in public, the woman who married his eldest brother, John III, was building something just as significant in far less visibility. Blanchette Hooker was born in 1909 and married John D. Rockefeller III in 1932. John III was the quietest of the five brothers, the most genuinely cultural, the most seriously philanthropic, the least interested in elected office. He poured enormous energy into the arts and into international cultural exchange, and Blanchette shared those commitments completely. She became a trustee of MoMA, the museum Abbey had built, and eventually its chairman of the board. She did not simply attend galas and put her name on donor rolls. She attended the board meetings. She made the decisions. She understood the institutional mechanics of how a museum of that scale was actually run, and she applied that understanding for decades. She was too important to be invisible, and too thoroughly her husband's partner in the public record, to be seen as entirely her own person. The biographies describe her as a devoted supporter of the arts. They do not spend much time on the specifics of what she actually did, or what she thought. Across the decades, she spent building something that bore other people's names. John III died in July of 1978. He was 72 years old, driving his own car on the Taconic Parkway in New York, when a teenage driver drifted into his lane. The collision was sudden and ordinary, and entirely without the weight that a life built so deliberately deserved at its end. Blanchette continued. She kept working at MoMA and in the broader world of cultural philanthropy for years after his death. She died in 1992 at 83. She had given more than 4 decades to institutions that carry her mother-in-law's name and her husband's name and the family name. Her own name is in the fine print. And then there is the loss that runs underneath all of it like a fault line. The loss that the women of this family carried not from divorce or disappointment, but from a disappearance that was never explained and never resolved. Michael Clark Rockefeller was 23 years old in November of 1961 when he vanished off the coast of New Guinea. He had been traveling in the Asmat region as part of a Harvard expedition studying indigenous art. His boat capsized in rough water. He and a companion attempted to swim to shore. The companion was eventually rescued. Michael was never found. His body was never recovered. The searches were extensive and ultimately found nothing. For years, his disappearance was treated as a drowning. In more recent decades, investigative reporting has raised the possibility that he was killed by members of a local tribe in an act connected to earlier colonial violence in the region. Those accounts remain contested. The family has never publicly accepted them. What is not contested is what the disappearance meant for the women who loved him. Mary Todd Hunter Clark received the news of her youngest son's vanishing as a woman who was already navigating the first year of life after 30 years of marriage had been ended without her choosing. She now had to absorb the particular unbearable uncertainty of a child who was not dead but could not be found. There is no account of how she processed this. She did not speak publicly about Michael, just as she did not speak publicly about the divorce. The composure held. Whether that composure was a gift or a prison is something that can never quite be known. His twin sister, Mary Rockefeller Morgan, lost her brother and kept moving. She built a career in the non-profit sector and in education, working for decades in social welfare and youth development. Like so many of the women in this family, she carried the loss into quieter work. She did not let the cameras in. There was another brother whose story produced its own particular devastation for the women connected to him, and that brother was Winthrop. Winthrop Rockefeller was the fourth of the 5 and the most turbulent by a considerable distance. He had left New York in the early 1950s and moved to Arkansas, where he bought a farm and eventually became governor, the first Republican to hold that office in the state since Reconstruction. He was in many ways the brother who remade himself most radically, who put the most physical distance between himself and the family headquarters in New York, who tried to build something that felt like his own. But before Arkansas, before the farm and the political career, there was the marriage. In 1948, Winthrop married Giavut Pollock-Ute, a Lithuanian-born socialite and model who went by the name Bobo. She was beautiful and unconventional and entirely outside the world of the women the Rockefeller family had previously married into itself. Winthrop's family was not enthusiastic. Bobo was not the kind of woman they had imagined for him. She was not from a family whose name appeared in the right places. She had not been formed by the right institutions. The marriage lasted less than 2 years. When it ended badly and publicly. Bobo filed for divorce in 1950, alleging a series of cruelties and humiliations that she was specific and unflinching about in the legal proceedings. She described a husband who was volatile and dismissive, who treated her as an embarrassment in social settings, who made clear in countless small and large ways that she was tolerated rather than loved. The settlement negotiations were ugly. The final terms were not disclosed. The Rockefeller publicity apparatus worked hard to manage the coverage and succeeded in keeping the most damaging details out of the major papers. But what got through was still enough to make the family uncomfortable for years. Bobo walked away with a settlement and a son, Winthrop Paul, who was born in 1948 and raised primarily by her after the divorce. She raised him outside the Rockefeller apparatus, largely without the family's involvement, and the relationship between Winthrop Paul and his father's family was complicated for decades. Bobo herself lived a long life, dying in 2008 at the age of 90. She outlived Winthrop by more than 35 years. She never gave an account of the marriage that the public got to hear in full. She lived instead in a series of elegant residences, supported by the settlement, and she declined to be made into a cautionary tale. Her story is one that the family would prefer to have remain in the footnotes alongside Babs. But Bobo was not interested in remaining in the footnotes. She had arrived in the family at a moment when she was expected to be grateful for the invitation, and she had refused that framing from the beginning. That refusal cost her the marriage. It may also have been the thing that kept her intact. Winthrop remarried in 1956, this time to Jeanette Edris, a woman from Seattle who was a divorcee with children of her own. The second marriage was by most accounts genuinely warmer and more stable than the first. They had no biological children together, but Jeanette became stepmother to Winthrop Paul and navigated that role with evident care. She was a quieter presence than Bobo, less dramatic, less likely to generate headlines, and she managed the life of a governor's wife in Arkansas with a practicality that suited the circumstances. Winthrop died of pancreatic cancer in February of 1973 at the age of 60. He had governed Arkansas for 2 terms and lost a third, and he died before he was old. Jeanette outlived him and remained connected to Arkansas and to the philanthropic work they had done together there. She is not a well-known figure outside of Arkansas. She built something real and specific with the years she had, and she did it without requiring the world's attention to make it worthwhile. The story of Lawrence Rockefeller's wife follows a different pattern. Mary French Rockefeller, who married Lawrence in 1934, spent more than 60 years as the wife of the brother most committed to conservation. Lawrence was quieter than Nelson and less culturally ambitious than John III, but he had a genuine and deep relationship with the natural world. He worked with federal conservation programs for decades. He developed what would eventually be called ecotourism, building resort properties in places of extraordinary environmental significance in ways that tried to demonstrate that conservation and economic activity were not necessarily in conflict. He was a serious man doing serious work in an area that mattered, and Mary was beside him for all of it. She was known as gracious and intelligent and an exceptional hostess. She managed their homes and their social obligations and their public appearances with the kind of seamless efficiency that requires enormous skill and receives almost no credit because when it works, nobody notices it. She raised 4 children. She travelled with Lawrence to the conservation sites and the government meetings and the dedication ceremonies. She appeared in the photographs, always slightly to one side, always correctly dressed, always present without being quite visible. She did not leave behind institutions with her name on them. She did not run for office or give speeches about the causes she had spent her life adjacent to. What she left behind was a marriage of more than 60 years and 4 children, and a household that functioned so well for so long that nobody ever had to think about how it was done. She died in 1997. Lawrence died in 2004. Together, they had given more than 6 decades to work that shaped how America thinks about its land. Her contribution to that work is not measured, anywhere in particular. The women of the third generation faced a world that had changed in ways their grandmothers could not have anticipated, and their mothers had only partially navigated. They came of age in the 1960s and 1970s, at the exact moment when the assumptions that had governed the lives of the women above them were being pulled apart from the outside. The women's movement was naming things that had not been named before. The idea that a woman's primary obligation was to manage a household and support a husband's career was not simply being questioned. It was being rejected loudly and publicly, and with a force that the previous generation had not had access to. The Rockefeller women of the third generation responded to this differently from one another, in ways that reflected both the moment and the particular households they had been formed in. Some of them moved sharply away from the family. Some of them changed their names or used them reluctantly. Some of them built careers in areas that had nothing to do with the foundations and the boards and the institutional philanthropy that had been the primary outlet for the women above them. Anne Rockefeller Roberts, daughter of Nelson and Mary Todd Hunter Clark, became a family therapist and counselor. She wrote about relationships and family systems and the emotional dynamics that get passed down through generations alongside the money and the names. She worked with clients who did not know and did not particularly care that her grandfather had once been the most discussed private fortune in America. She was interested in the interior life, in what happens inside people when they grow up inside a structure of enormous wealth and expectation, in how identity survives those conditions or fails to. It is difficult to read about her career without understanding it as in part a direct response to what she witnessed from inside. A mother who endured with absolute composure and never once publicly named what she had endured. A father who was electric and charismatic and present in a particular showy way that was not quite the same as being available. A household held together by obligation and performance and the requirements of political ambition. Anne Rockefeller Roberts spent her professional life helping people find the words for things that had been done to them in the name of family love. That is not a coincidence. That is what happens when a perceptive woman grows up in a perceptive woman's situation and decides to do something with what she has seen. Her younger sister, Mary Rockefeller Morgan, the twin of the vanished Michael, chose a different kind of quiet. She went into education and social welfare. She raised her children. She kept the cameras out. She is the woman in this family who carries perhaps the most unresolvable grief, because the twin is never simply a sibling. The twin is the person who arrived at the same moment, who shared the first environment, who was the other half of an original pair. Michael's disappearance in 1961, when they were both 23, left a gap that no amount of time could simply fill in. Mary Rockefeller Morgan has not spoken publicly about what that grief has been. She kept moving, the way the women of this family kept moving, forward and quietly, and without making the cost visible to anyone who was not already inside it. The broader question that runs through all of these stories: The question that connects Abby hiding her paintings at the top of a building to Mary Todd Hunter Clark never giving her interview to Happy disclosing her mastectomy in 1974 is the question of what women do with what they are given and what they are not given, what they build out of the materials available to them, what they withhold, and what they finally say. The Rockefeller women were not uniformly trapped or uniformly silenced. Several of them exercised real power and made real decisions and shaped institutions that are still operating today. Abby's museum, Blanchette's decades of board leadership, Happy's public health disclosure, Anne's clinical and written work on the emotional inheritance of wealthy families. These are not small things. These are things that reached people and changed people and continued working in the world long after the women who created them were gone. But the conditions under which they did this work were conditions of persistent constraint. The assumption that the man's work was the main work and the woman's contribution was supplementary. The assumption that private suffering was to be managed privately and that composure was not just a social grace, but a moral obligation. The assumption that the name on the building would naturally be a man's name, and that a woman who contributed to what was inside the building was contributing to something larger than herself, which was true, but was also a way of making the contribution disappear. These assumptions did not disappear cleanly when the 1970s arrived. They faded unevenly, faster in some branches of the family than others, more completely in the generation that came of age after the women's movement than in the generation that had to navigate the movement in real time while also managing everything that had come before. The women of the fourth generation carry less of this particular weight. They have access to frameworks for understanding what their grandmothers and great-grandmothers experienced that the grandmothers and great-grandmothers did not have while they were living it. But they carry the name, and the name does not simplify. It complicates, it opens doors, and it forecloses ordinary existence simultaneously. It makes trust difficult in the specific way that vast inherited wealth makes trust difficult, because you cannot always know what someone is responding to when they respond to you. The Rockefeller women of every generation have navigated this uncertainty. The earlier ones navigated it without speaking about it. The later ones have had more freedom to name it, and some of them have. But naming it and resolving it are not the same thing. There is a photograph that exists from the 1940s of Abby Aldrich Rockefeller standing in the gallery of the Museum of Modern Art she founded, looking at a painting. She is not posed for the photograph in the way that wealthy women were typically posed for photographs in that era. She is not turned toward the camera. She is looking at the work. Her back is mostly to the lens. What you can see is the posture of someone who is entirely absorbed, entirely present, entirely in the place she most wanted to be. It is a small photograph. It does not appear on the walls of MoMA. But it captures something that the formal portraits and the donor plaques and the institutional histories do not, which is a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and why it mattered, standing inside the proof of it. That is the image worth holding when you think about the Rockefeller women, not the formal portraits, not the composure, not the footnotes. The woman looking at the painting, the woman who built the room and then stood inside it and looked at what she had loved all along. The loneliness was real. The cost was real. The invisibility was real, and it was systematic, and it lasted for more than a century across a family that had every conceivable resource and used most of those resources to make men more visible and women more comfortable in their invisibility. That is the honest accounting of it, and it should be said plainly. But the museum is still standing. The garden that bears Abby's name is still there every day, filled with people who have no idea what it cost to build it. The women who sought mammograms in the weeks after Happy made her disclosure in 1974 are still part of the medical record, even if her name is not. The clients who sat across from Anne Rockefeller Roberts and found words for things that had been wordless still carry what they found there. Mary Rockefeller Morgan is still alive, still carrying the twin she lost in 1961, still moving forward in the way that the women of this family have always moved forward, which is quietly and without asking for credit, and with a persistence that the world tends to mistake for acceptance. It was never acceptance. It was building. It was always building. Under constraint and in private, and against the expectations of the people who held the money and the names and the formal power. The Rockefeller women built anyway. They built museums, and they built public health awareness, and they built families, and they built frameworks for understanding what families do to the people inside them. They built in whatever direction was available to them, and when one direction was closed, they found another. That is not a small legacy. That is, in fact, an enormous one. It is just not the kind that gets its name on a building. And given what it took to produce it, given what was withheld, and what was endured, and what was carried in silence across more than a century, it deserves at the very least to be told out loud. If you found this video worthwhile, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more stories like this one.